Could you please take your seats? We're going to go ahead now with our panel discussion. Guys, and it's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Pat.
And I'm not going to say much. I'm simply going to follow the same routine. I have some index cards that have come already, so if those of you who have questions and would like to submit them in that format, I will permit the panelists to speak to one another or to question one another first. Try to be as compact as possible in your comments to one another. I will then read some of the questions that I've gotten or conflate. I mean, some of the questions overlap a bit, and then we will turn it to those of you who have, for whom other thoughts have arisen in the time being. Do you have questions for one another? Okay.
Yeah, I think it'll launch right in.
I think one of the questions that I heard repeated a number of times, the question about debiasing natural language processing. The question of language was sort of passed over, and so all the examples involved English, but or based in languages in which gender is less prominent than in a language like French or German or even German or Spanish, and I wonder if you have anything to say about. Don't you need to debias human language first? And I think there was another observation about the degree to which researchers like Lera Boroditsky talks about, for example, the word for bridge in French is masculine and the word for bridge in German is feminine, and people respond to the same bridge with very different adjectives. How do you build that in? So maybe we can start with that question.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. We were actually just having with Shafi a very interesting discussion during the break about those lines. Similar questions arise in Hebrew and also in Chinese. So the short answer is that is an active area that we're currently actively working on. I don't really have a lot of answers right now. So the reason why we really just immediately focused on English first is that's where a lot of the mostly commonly used embedding, public embedding algorithms are being trained on. And even within English, there's already a lot of interesting variation. For example, if you look at different types in the different corpus of data, like if you take news articles versus Wikipedia, or news articles from New York Times versus from Wall Street Journal or from BBC, right? So there's already a lot of really interesting variation that we're trying to, geographic and cultural variation we're like to tease apart just within English. So that's basically mostly occupying us for now. We are working with some collaborators to look at this for other languages, especially languages as the question mentioned that has gender that are really much more built into the words, into the language itself compared to English or Chinese.
One other thing, just as you were talking, I was wondering about in sort of changing gender signifiers with what would be, is it keeping up with like the emergence over the last decade, just in English again, of they, them pronouns, things of that sort.
Or Latinx.
Or Latinx, right?
Yeah, so that itself is also a really important point. So the initial work has a very strong limitation, and it's basically looking at basically gender binaries. And I think that's certainly a big limitation of the work. So there are some technical challenges just from the algorithm's perspective. Actually, what's the best way to really quantify all the different groups? Because there's some technical reasons when the algorithm we need to essentially find just the good stable anchors to identify these different groups. And that's already challenging, as we discussed, to do with binary gender, and it's even more challenging to do. But that's certainly something we're also very busy working on.
Yeah, but so it just struck me that you've got, I have no idea how you might go about doing this, but just the fact that we're at a historical moment where you have an emergent new sort of set of signifiers, I mean, probably just messes everything up, but also could provide some really interesting opportunities. I'm not quite sure how, but.
Yeah, well, I feel skeptical about the messing everything up part, because it seems to me one of the problems we've always had, if we start on a certain kind of project similar to this, with a set of binaries that already reflect a particular cultural set of assumptions, and then we've got to fix it to add what is really a bigger picture. I mean, I think I always feel like why can't we ever? So fixing it and expanding becomes the problem, right? I'm not actually saying that's negative, but I'm just saying it becomes a problem. Why can't we begin with the fact that this has to be absolutely provisional, right? It's going to be taking on soon. Just what we were talking about, Latinx, the changing pronouns for trans people, so that we're not. Because every time we represent, if we start here, we're going to have something that is considered a norm. And then everything else is going to be problematic to that norm. And I would be concerned about doing that.
And can I sort of expand, because there's a question that is along the same lines. Language is not necessarily binary, but polysemic. Provisional markers are not necessarily stable. Pronomial markers are not necessarily stable, but prone to innovation and change. How do you account for the fact that you are not getting, or perhaps not getting, stereotypes, but normative or hegemonic ideas as a result of the researcher's own confirmation biases?
Right. So also a very good point. Very good question. Right? So there's a couple of ways that we try to essentially find orthogonal sources of information to basically to go beyond our own confirmation bias. Right? So basically, from a scientist's perspective, okay, so we know what are the limitations of algorithms. The most we try to do is to really try to find, can we find orthogonal sources of data? Right? So we tried this a few different ways. One is to basically use these large-scale citizen science. Right? So can we, to go beyond our own confirmation bias, can we actually try to get inputs from people? And when we do this citizen science, we can actually try to get data inputs from diverse communities and diverse groups. Right? So that's one way we can try to get more sources of validation. So the other one, which also is very much limited, is from using public data sets like the US Census and using previous studies. Right? So they have their own limitations, which is certainly important to talk about, but we think of them as sort of orthogonal validations.
Nancy had a question, and I can't read your handwriting, Nancy. So I wonder if you could possibly, it looks really interesting. So.
I write very small. I was trying to write large.
The size is not the only problem here.
So the first was on the assumptions embedded in the language. And Evelyn, I was really thinking about your presentation about the mesh language, and that it also seems that somehow they're not getting at like the fundamental problem with the notion of Caucasian and the Caucasoid terminology, which is that it's scientifically discredited on other grounds. Because when Blumenbach came up with that, which most people don't know if they're not like floating around this literature, he chose the Caucasus because it had Mount Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark was supposed to have landed, and it seemed like a sort of neutral place, not in the midst of a lot of European politics at the time, to say that white people and also humanity emerged from that, and it puts whites/Caucasians at the center, and then the others degenerated. Literally, that's the terminology used, degenerated. And so that from the framework of, if you have an out-of-Africa hypothesis for origins of humanity, it's a completely invalid term. And so I can't understand why it would even be allowed to continue. I get your point, which is you're picking up older literature that's used it. But just like, and this is a completely elusive quest where you ask for like the flagging of obnoxious, racist, violent language, whether it's in Twitter or in Facebook or whatever, cannot mesh find a way to flag this is a racist study, it has the wrong assumptions behind it, versus this is a study that's using language appropriately. So that was one I'm just sort of thinking about, because that framing and that terminology is fundamentally flawed from any kind of rigorous, credible science. And so I always will tell people, and if I'm reviewing articles, you cannot use the word Caucasian or any of the other permutations, let alone Negroid, Mongoloid, et cetera, because it's just completely incompatible with contemporary scientific knowledge tested by lots of people robustly around the world. So that was a question of how could you, in these things where you're relying on older data and older studies, is there a way to make them flag, this is bad, don't use this term, use that one? And so that was that. And then the related question was to you, Harriet, also on the census data. For the 1840 controversy, I just think a really important point about the latitude, it was basically the further north you go, the more likely blacks are to be insane, had also to do, it wasn't that it was falsified data, it was that it was really lousy data presentation. So the problem was for the 1840 census, there was one line. What?
Both were transpiring, I think.
Yeah, but there's much stronger on the problems, because this is, again, where I think data scientists can be really helpful in understanding how do you structure the data records to get a better science. Because what was happening was for the 1840 census, you had all data for a family on one line of data, and there were all these columns that went on forever. And then what happened is they introduced this term of idiot for a really nice sympathetic term for people that had mental problems. For white people that were classified as that could easily be put in the black column. So there were plenty of white people who were classified as old and mentally incapable who were put in lines and then claimed to be black when obviously there was not a black population. And public health people, and Evelyn knows this very well, Shattuck in particular, what he did with after that, he was brought into the 1850 census to actually for the first time have records be by individual within families to reduce that kind of data error. So I think there's a lesson in here about how we have systematic data collection that can reduce these kinds of errors that come into play. But I'd really be curious, Evelyn, for your point about how can you flag bad uses, given what you've discovered?
Yeah, so, I'm sorry.
I want to add to the question
Okay.
and get the answer together, which is if the basic terms are so completely invalid anyway, what's the quality of the medicine? What's the quality of the research? And should the whole article, I mean, we talked earlier about getting rid of the database. Is this something where we should be flagging this as this is, I'm not saying to actually destroy it, but to flag it as this is something that should be destroyed because it's working with completely flawed categories?
So there's probably many variations and directions we could go to the answer to that. But I think part of it is with the National Library of Medicine, they would have to confront and take a stand on the fact of what these categories, the kind of work these categories have actually done as people use them in their research. So the National Library of Medicine, not exactly the most radical institution in the federal government. I don't think they want to take that stand. Meanwhile, also, that, all the different kinds of researchers that are submitting articles with using Caucasian all the time. Again, who's going to say that this has to stop for this set of reasons, both historical and political and medical, such that it does not provide an adequate or even reasonable or quote-unquote scientifically valid way to characterize some white people in America of certain kinds of descent, right? So I just think that nobody wants to take up the question. And so I think it's partly, my personal view is mostly political, but I also think it's technical and structural in that it would require them to do a kind of a reverse engineering on some of the pieces that are continue to be pulled along even as they improve the quote-unquote effectiveness of the kind of searches that they do. So, I mean, you have to decide to stop doing something. And also, what I wanted to say this morning was that the fact that in order for certain kinds of things to change like this, we need a robust process to hold institutions like this accountable who are holding on to data that will be used in medical situations that affect people's lives. But there is no robust accountability process. So at what point do I, as a citizen, write to NLM and say, I don't want to see Caucasoid on here, and God knows I don't want to see Negroid in here anymore. I mean, they'll say, well, gee, Evelyn Helms, thank you for your letter, and we'll take it under consideration. That'll be probably the end of it.
I could not agree with you more that this is an important issue. However, where does it end? I'm thinking about the Pernkopf question. The Pernkopf Atlas was devised by a beautiful atlas of the human body, devised by.
We have microphones for you.
She has a mic.
She has
I
one
have
on.
one, but
Oh, you do? Oh, okay.
it's not working, right? Okay. Anyway, the Pernkopf Atlas, a beautiful atlas of the human body, devised using some Holocaust survivors, done by an Austrian Nazi, and many people think we should not use it. And we have clung to it because it was accurate, because it was so beautiful. We have not been willing to give it up. And I think that there is a great deal of research, not just definitions. I think that's like the tip of the proverbial iceberg. A great deal of research that forms the basis of our canon that was conducted by abusing subjects, very often African Americans, other groups as well. And so where do we institute, where do we end it? You know, where do we decide where something's not acceptable? Personally, I would love to see us decide that we're not going to use the research that was performed on African Americans, but what would our canon look like in that case? You know, even though I would like to see that happen, I'm well aware that it would completely transform, you know, our image of medicine. There would be a cost, in other words.
Can I add? So we're part of this new project called the Human Cell Atlas, which is an international effort, very ambitious, to essentially create something like a Google Maps for the human body. Right? And I think a lot of the points that you're raising here are extremely important for that project, and it's not currently considered for that project, because really the goal there is to create reference. If the Human Genome Project is to create a reference human genome, right, for humans, the Human Cell Atlas is to really create a reference map for individual cells in your body, right? For skin, for hair, for neurons, all the different cell types. And I think it would be extremely important for just as an opportunity for people here to actually engage.
From where would the
with that.
samples be derived?
Exactly. So.
Would you use HeLa, for example? If you were to use HeLa, it would be, difficult.
Right. So they're not using. So they're using a lot of other sources of sample, not from HeLa.
Right.
But right now, I don't think there's a comprehensive plan and roadmap to see what are the cell types, what are the donors, who will be the donors to get these different cell types from.
Is this your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question is for James. I think maybe just because I was tired at the end of your talk, I was having a hard time following what precisely you were plotting in this chart where you were comparing, when you were talking about how the word embeddings across time change. And I'm curious whether any part of that statistical analysis, you drew boxes and lines of where certain historical events took place, but I didn't know if those historical events played any role in your analysis other than you seeing some change, yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I didn't go through that in too much detail. So basically, so the high-level idea is that at every time point we have an embedding or set of vectors for these different adjectives and for different stereotypes. And across any two different time points, I can compute how similar they are, how correlated these
Like
embeddings
a covariance.
That's right, like a correlation metric. And that's, so that heat map that I was showing basically was just showing the similarities across the different time
So
points.
does this just mean it changes over time?
So it was just showing that there's a few pretty abrupt time points where we see especially dramatic changes in these embeddings of the different stereotypes. So that's the analysis we did just purely on the text data. And what we did afterward was to basically more as a post hoc annotation to see basically what if now we have pinpointed a few time points where we see such large shifts, what actually happened in those time points that could be relevant. So we didn't actually do, so it's not a causal analysis because we did that post hoc, but it's just, I was just showing you a few events where, based on our collaboration with the historians, where we think those actually are likely to be meaningful events.
There's another question for
Hi, this is again for Dr. Zhu. The insights of your studies were very interesting and useful and informative. They were also very consistent with a large body of Asian American studies scholarship. So I was curious to know your relationship to that scholarship and whether it's useful to cite those studies in your research, whether the value that it's added to the kind of big data analysis and algorithmic data driven work is primarily one of speed. In other words, maybe it takes you less time to do this work than, say, a historian who would have already gone through those newspapers and looked at the semiological meanings that are generated around, say, the Asian perils from the late 19th century and how they changed at precisely the time points you also plotted for us.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. We certainly think we view this as a tool useful for exploratory analysis, right? Because now, essentially any historian or any social scientist can basically look at a particular time point and see what are the patterns. For some of the time points, we were able to actually find additional analysis from specific studies, for example, based on surveys or population studies that came from those particular time points. Right? And as you said, so they are consistent with the results that we showed here. So I view this as now we can actually fill in some of the gaps, right? Because those individual studies, for example, conducted by a series of Princeton sociologists were over, they only did about 3 time points, right? And other studies also only focused on a few different time points. So now we actually, with this data, can actually get at least do exploratory analysis across multiple time points, at least in the US. So one is just makes it easier to do exploratory analysis much more quickly. The second is that it would fill in some of the time points that were not covered in the previous studies and surveys.
Here's a question for Evelyn. Relating to the slide Evelyn showed on, or makeup of Google workforce, I'm interested if there are results that the workplace diversity, or that relates, or that link workforce diversity and product/output. Note, not that diverse workforce is not important in and of itself.
So I don't know of any. I think it's a good question. I mean, so I think it's interesting. Google is one of the few places that actually started publishing a diversity report over the last few years, just sort of basic, kind of demographic data about their workforce. They don't break it down, at least not in the publicly released report, on different types of jobs, different types of products, platforms that people might be working on. I mean, those are all the kinds of things you'd really want to know. Who's actually working on like Google Translate or some of the search projects or any of that, and how diverse are those specific groups. I think they would probably be a little reticent about letting us know that. And given the small numbers, the percentage of the diversity for the entire company. But they're really, really important because, again, it means that it probably means that in certain places, the products reflect the fact that some of the questions people with a different perspective might ask are not getting asked as the apps are getting developed. They're just not they're not asking those questions. And then when they get blowback, if they're released in the public, then they're like, well, what happened? Why didn't we think about that? But that's because they're not having those kinds of conversations, or at least they're not willing to admit that they're having those kind of conversations.
There's a question for Harriet. Could you please bring the message home 1,000-fold that low IQ tests are strongly correlated to bad prenatal care, and thus interventions must be put in place with regard to that?
Excellent point. They do indeed correlate to bad. And the bad prenatal care, unfortunately, is sometimes intentional. I'm not saying it always is, sometimes is, for a very sad reason. Studies had shown that, back in 1992, studies showed that African American women and Hispanic women were the group least likely to be advised to stop smoking during their pregnancies. Now the group least likely to be advised to do that are Native American women. Also, there are a California survey, I forget who did it, but a California survey showed that most physicians do not discuss disparate environmental toxicity impact with pregnant women who are Black and Hispanic, even though they're well aware that these women are at the highest risk. But when asked why, clinicians typically said, oh, these are people who have so many horrific circumstances. They have a lot of survival issues, and it just seems like burdensome to also tell them not to eat too much fish during the week, to take their, and I'm thinking, but they're at highest risk, so how can you not tell them? Silence is like killing, unborn children. And I'm sympathetic with, I am, suppose, sympathetic for their desire not to burden their patients more, but I think there's nothing probably more burdensome than having a child with a defect that could have been prevented by good care. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of prenatal care. I think when people think of that, they think of drinking and smoking, because that's often what's focused on, unfortunately, women of color. It's a form of blaming the victim, demonizing women. Well, you were pregnant, you knew that, you were smoking, you were drinking. But a lot of mothers, especially Hispanic African American mothers, are younger than the norm, and they tend to not know that they're pregnant for 2 months. During that time, they might have already done social drinking. There's also a lot of, among women of all ethnic groups, a lot of misunderstanding about the dangers of alcohol, which we don't completely understand yet. And a lot of women kind of assume that by their 3rd trimester, toward the end, the baby's fully formed, and yet that's at exactly the point where the most harm can be done to a fetus when a woman drinks. So there are a lot of things going on there that women need to be better informed of by their physicians, and they're not getting that information they need. And one little grace note I have to add is that there's a small, very small contingent of actually abusive prenatal care programs, where in North Carolina, when women came to prenatal care programs, as they were told to do by PSAs and their doctors, and confessed to drug use, the hospital reported them to authorities, and they were arrested. And only a few women, we're talking about 40 women that we know of, but the word gets out. Now women who need prenatal care are going to know about this. They read about it in the paper, and they're afraid to go. So we have a lot of work to do here.
Can I just, it was my question, but I think my question was a little different. So, and that is that,
I think you made it was extremely striking how these lower IQ points are related to the bad prenatal care and bad advice and so forth. But I guess my question is, now that could it be that we can think of these algorithms or these machine learning tools that make it so abundantly obvious, okay, it makes it so clearly true, okay, and so as a tool to get it out in the public's mind that this is what's happening. So I'm trying to think
clear
that this correlation between lowered IQ and prenatal and bad prenatal care is very clear. So it's clear to you. But what I am saying is that I'm wondering, is there any way to say that our tools, or Google's tools or whatever, could be used for a good end rather than reinforcing something that's
We need an
it's
algorithm
negative.
that's going to be accurate. And right now, we don't even have accurate advice and data. There's not agreement, for example, on how much fish. We know that most of the fish that women eat, especially when they're subsistence farming, are going to be tainted with mercury. We know that. What we don't know is, because fish is such an important food for building the fetal brain, is the risk from avoiding fish, high quality protein, is that risk greater than the risk from the mercury? There's a lot of disagreement in the medical field. You're going to get, we actually will see different advice from different governmental agencies, for example. So
So you're saying even though we know the problem, we don't know what the right intervention
in
is?
this case, we're not sure what the best advice, I'm not sure what the best advice is. You have people giving diametrically different advice to women. all having what looked like good data, at least to me. So there's no consensus yet, okay? So if we don't have a consensus, then you can't build an algorithm. So, there's work that has to be done. But, the real issue here is not bad prenatal care, because there is bad prenatal care, lacking prenatal care. But the real issue is the need for prenatal care and advice. And not all women are getting it. So in terms of making sure women all get the right prenatal care and advice, I think that should be our focus. The miscreants are there, but I think they're too few to focus our energy on. We should be focusing our energy on getting the right message out first. So there you have it. But I think that understanding what the real risks are is often it's clear. We know that good nutrition is essential, and we also know that many women that I'm writing about live in, people call them food deserts because they don't have access to good nutrition that's economically feasible. I call them food swamps because a lack of nutrition is often coupled with potent alcohol, rampant cigarette and tobacco advertising. You mix all that together, and of course, you're going to end up with, very bad, natal outcomes. It's going to happen. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to do. But, making sure the prenatal care women get is accurate is, of course, important. But it's also really important to make sure that all women have access to what they need. You can tell them to eat well, but you have to make sure they're able to do that.
That high-protein slurry you mentioned earlier today.
So I think came up in your talk as well. All right. I understand that our machine learning has a lot of problems at bay, but it's also a tool of possibly immense value. And the question is, how can you embrace that or advise us how to make it a better tool rather than just say, well, you guys as mathematicians and scientists, I'm rephrasing you a little bit, really don't get it, you can't get it, it's lawmakers and policy makers that it's where it's at.
Yeah, so in many respects, I was trying to not say that the scientists aren't getting it, but that some of the policymakers aren't getting it, right? So the idea is that a tool is not the same thing as a solution, right? But that a lot of people in legal and policy circles think that this tool is a solution, and that's a problem. So it's a matter of sort of, as I said to somebody afterwards, sort of like a place for everything and everything in its place, right? And realizing, because there is this kind of imperialism of metrics, right? Where there's this tendency for it to sort of expand beyond the boundaries of its sort of appropriate sphere of authority. So it's in many respects more about sort of a call to sort of recalibrate, right, and rethink through what is the appropriate relationship between these worlds of law, policy, politics, democracy, and expertise, machine learning, science, algorithms. And in many respects, my critique is more on the people in sort of my world who sort of think, all the messy problems of politics can be solved by science. And just one other thing I was thinking of, Harriet, as you were talking too, is to think about how Target knows women are pregnant before their partners do. And they know this, and they start sending them push notifications. But also how that too is sort of raced and classed in terms of like who. Target has a pretty broad demographic, database in terms of who shops there. But I'm wondering if is that a place for algorithms in a sense to sort of supplement? If you're not going to have your doctor telling you don't drink and don't smoke, maybe Target will.
Yeah, well, and that could be useful. However, and I don't know the demographics, but I do know that Target has very cheap prescription drugs. I know it's sort of a beacon for me, and I'm sure that for a lot of people too. But the thing is,
conflict of interest?
no. But this might sound a little bit far afield, but it puts me in mind of one thing I have noticed, which troubles me, this emphasis on personal responsibility. Of course it's a good thing. Of course we want women, among other things, to take responsibility for ensuring fetal health, to do everything they can. But the problem comes in when you're exhorting women to take control of something they have no way of controlling. They have no way of controlling their exposure to environmental toxins, you know? Short of, you know, deciding how much fish to eat every week, and they may not have control over that. A lot of subsistence fishing. I mentioned in my talk that I was told by a Johns Hopkins researcher that African Americans don't do subsistence fishing. So that's people who fish in order to feed their families, you know, not for sport, not to sell, but to put food on the table. I said, that's a surprise to me, because my father did fishing. He would go out hunting with his friends. They had a boat, they would fish, they would hunt, and we'd eat venison whether we wanted it or not, you know. But it's something that we did, everyone in our family did, everybody I knew did, and I'd seen it a lot. So to be told by somebody it didn't happen, and then to realize that they actually thought that because no one had studied it, no one had collated that data. So there was a whole underground, you know, effect. So anyway, the bottom line is that most exposure, though, you know, the phthalates, the PCBs, the heavy metals, they have no way of mediating that, and yet they're held responsible for it. So I think we have to be really careful. Even smoking up to a point, you know.
But it's similar. This is also a case where the data can lead people in different directions. So I've told the story many times. So I get a call one day from a researcher at Johns Hopkins that says, we're going to start a new program, public health, where at the black churches in Baltimore, they're going to give away free fruit at the end of services, right, on Sunday. But they said, but we've looked at some of the data, and the people in East Baltimore don't eat fruit. And I said, have you seen the fruit in East Baltimore? I mean, these little stores, corner stores, the fruit is horrible looking, and it's wicked expensive. But the assumption made from all the data, that the data was correct. Black people were not buying fruit in East Baltimore. Right. But it's not because they didn't like fruit or wanted fruit or saw the value of fruit. It was this other issue. But that could not be seen through that. So I think it's something, back to something Dorothy said this morning about, and I think it's a kind of, I wanted to speak to what you said about the scientists getting it, but the politicians are responsible for policy things. I still think that my assessment is the racism in the medical system is deep and pervasive, and you have to start there and assume that if someone calls you with a comment like a question like, is it true, based on our data, it's true that black people don't eat fruit, and you just say yes, and you have to question that because it makes no sense, right? I mean, if you think of most people like fruit. I mean, but if you don't think black people are the same kind of people.
And the person who told you that probably congratulated themselves on their cultural competence.
Exactly.
Cultural competence has got to be tempered by cultural humility. You know,
Exactly.
you've got to know what you don't know, and that doesn't happen often enough.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Right. The presumption of difference is so deep that that kind of assertion made sense to the scientists. And I'm saying it's got to get to a point where it doesn't make sense.
I think we.
Good science and bad science. You know,
No, I think it's about challenging certain presumptions and assumptions, and that those have to be challenged all the time if we take seriously that the whole system is riven with a certain kind of racial bias.
We have run out of time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.